Authors, editors, publishers, book cover designers, agents, critics, readers. I am your host, Koral Dasgupta, all set to ask some interesting, straightforward, and fun questions to our guests. We will be talking today to author Manjari Prabhu, who is also a dear friend, but more importantly, she runs the Pune International Literature Festival, and recently she has also started Pune International Spiritual Festival. Welcome to the show, Manjari.
Hi, Koral.
So, Manjari, most importantly, something that I always wanted to ask you is astrology plays a role in your books, which is very unique and very unlikely. I mean, you write thrillers, and I have seen that a lot of astrology plays an important role there. How did it get there? What is the role of astrology in your life?
Oh, yes. So astrology has a very huge role. I've grown up, being in this atmosphere of astrology because my mom is an astrologer.
Oh.
And yes, and she's a very renowned astrologer, in fact, and she's very highly sought. So it's very easy for me. I've been, using her like how should I say, a sounding board, an advisory board, all kinds of board, because for every single thing I go to her. So,
Okay.
but how did it happen in the books? Well, there's a story attached to it. So there was this one Bollywood director who once wanted to ask my mom something. He said it's very urgent, and they were in a bit of a kind of a party. So luckily she remembered his horoscope, and she said, "What is it?" So he said, "Tell me if I shall ever have a son." And she looked at his horoscope and said, "Do you want to go somewhere private? Because there's something I need to tell you." So he said, "No, all these are friends. You can just tell me what it is." So she said, "Okay, you asked me if you will ever have a son. And your horoscope says that you already have a son, except that you can't claim him as yours." And so, yes. And so when she told him this, he was, of course, shocked because it was true. And when she told me this, I was shocked because I realized the potential of a horoscope. It was like an X-ray of a person, and you could tell so many things from it, whether you believe in it or not. And I wondered, why had no one ever used it in solving a crime? Because along with all the deduction methods and the police methods, this was one very important tool to really probe into the mind of a character, of a person. And I said, let me try to use this in fiction. I don't think anyone had ever done that. So that's how the Cosmic Clues and Stellar Signs was born.
So, Manjari, since you began with thrillers, would you like to tell us how challenging it is to write a thriller? Because thriller is not something that goes by a general flow. It has a lot of backlinks. You go back, take clues from there, go to front, and there is a lot of that permutation combination happening. How difficult or how easy is it to write a thriller?
Well, I think it's a very difficult format. Not because I'm writing it, but because I know that with every book that I write, I find it more and more difficult. Simply because any mystery or thriller will not follow, how should I say, a free-flowing format. Normally authors can sit and let the novel develop on its own. You can't do that with mystery, at least the kind of mysteries I write or the way I work. I have to work backwards from who did it. And when I say that, it means that I know who's done it, and now I don't want the readers to know who did it right till the last page, which means there's a lot of how should I say, formatting and lots of construction of plot, lots of clues, lots of layering of characters. Everything adds to the surprise element of the novel, and that is why it is difficult. And because deceiving the reader and yet keeping the reader happy are two very contrasting things that you have to achieve, and that is very difficult, I feel. So it's not an easy format to write.
You say it's such a beautiful thing that deceiving the reader and yet keeping the reader happy is a difficult thing to achieve. Yes. I mean, these are the things that I take back as my learning as well. So Manjari, once again, that since you have been into astrology and with books, obviously books are a part of every author's heart. So given that truth, do you have specific expectations when it comes to the books, and are you very specific about it? For example, I don't know anything about astrology. So being a layman, if I may ask you, that, for example, book cover designs, right? There are elements to be placed in particular locations. There are colors to be used. Do you have a say in those, or do you completely trust the designer on that?
I like to have a say in it if I can. Simply
do.
because, when I was a kid, the first thing that drew me to a book was the cover. And I felt that even before I could read, I knew that the cover used to fascinate me. The covers still fascinate me. And I feel that it's a very important step to creating a readership. So when it comes to my books, I try to make sure that I have the cover the way I would like it. I mean, if I had to see this book in a group of 100 books, it has to stand out. And I want to make sure that it does stand out. So yes, I do give in my suggestions and I do make changes. And luckily for me, my publishers agreed with me. So, well, yes, I think it's very important. The cover has to be just perfect for the mood of the book.
So given that, you have published with many publishers, right? You don't publish with one publisher.
No, I've done 7-8 years. That's true.
So you must have interacted with so many people in the publishing world. Would you like to tell us an inspiring memory from there? Someone you may have interacted with, someone who have contributed a lot to your writing, to you as a person. How does that investment happen?
Well, yes, that's not really an easy question, because I think every editor in every way has added a little bit to my knowledge and, to my learning. Having said that, there's one editor particularly called Kate Misiak. So these two books of mine, The Cosmic Clues and Stellar Science, which was originally The Astral Lullaby, were published by Random House USA. And my editor then was Kate Misiak, who was also the VP of Bantam Books. And when I started working with her, I was very, very nervous because it was my first international editor, my first international publishing house. And I just kept feeling, our English, there's so many inhibitions in your mind. I never had any, but when it came to these two books and Random House USA, I was a little worried, the kind of editing that was going to take place. But you won't believe it, when the books came to me for proofreading, there were barely any corrections in it. She had added changes, and so when I asked her, how did you like the books? So she said that each book is stronger than the first one. So it kind of stayed with me, the confidence she kind of showed in me. And I think that's where I really got the confidence of never doubting my writing ever. She said, whatever you've written is good enough, and I don't want to make any changes. Except for a little Americanization of words that were needed. Like, for example, idli sambar had to be explained, or pav bhaji had to be explained, because the books take place in India, Pune, and they were being published in America. So she wanted a few. Yeah. So those were the only things she added. But she gave me so much confidence in my writing that I don't think I've ever looked back.
That's a lot of liberty for a writer also, no? That when an editor understands you so much from inside.
Absolutely. I've never had an issue with any editor ever after that. I mean, not that I had before, but I know when I want to say no, and I know when I want to say yes to an editor completely.
Wonderful. So why did you go to Random House USA? Was it just an experiment, or you had a reason, or you were being agented?
No, there was a reason for it. I had written, so this was in 2004, and I'd written the books in about 2002. And I came up with this idea of astrology and crime and all. And I thought, what a brilliant idea. Let me submit it to all the Indian publishers. Okay. And you won't believe it. Every single Indian publisher then kind of rejected the book. And I was very surprised. Yeah, because in 2004, I don't think any Indian woman author was writing mystery. I was the first. So it was a very new concept for them. We were all heavily into literary fiction, and mainstream fiction still had to come in a big way. So probably that was one of the reasons, which was a good thing for me, because what I did was I said, it's all right. If the Indian publishers don't want it. I found myself an American agent who got me a 2-book deal with Random House. So instead of earning in rupees, I earned in dollars.
Oh my God.
Which was a great thing for me.
Yeah, God bless that.
I know.
So, Manjari, the closest person when it comes to setting up a literature festival, the closest person I have known is you. Okay. So I would like to ask you that how was it to set up Pune International Literature Festival? I mean, it's a huge responsibility to get into from simply book writing. How did it come to you, and how did you go about it?
Like you said, it's a huge, huge task, a huge responsibility. And one of the reasons was that Pune had no Litfest. There were lit fests happening all over India, but nothing in Pune. And I thought it was me and my team thought that let's bring a literature festival to Pune, and that is how it started. However, when we did that, we had no clue of the gigantic leap I was taking from being a writer, like you said, a mere writer, to an organizer. It's a huge task, and I had no idea the kind of hidden treasures I had within me. It requires, I call them treasures because I've learned a lot over the years. PILF has grown from 2013 to 2020 into one of the top lit fests of India today. And I'm really proud of it, not just because of what I have achieved, but because what
PILF has
become, yes. And it's, of course, my team is very involved in it, and there are a lot of people, there are authors who have supported me, and it's a huge thing. But what I really learned from it is that being a writer is one thing, being an organizer is another thing. One of the main reasons is that you have to raise funds for a huge festival like that. Everything has to be budgeted. I had no idea of the kind of sums, mathematics and calculations I would be involved in. The kind of the curating is at least even a part of it. The curating is fun sometimes, but it's like a jigsaw puzzle where you have 170 jigsaw pieces strewn all over India, and then I try to bring in pieces from every part of the country to put them in one little panel, and try to make some sense out of that panel, and with the hope of not repeating it every year. So you have to bring in novelty, you have to bring in new speakers, you have to bring in new work, you have to promote new authors, you have to bring back established authors, because when established authors come, the money comes in, and that is how the new authors are then recognized and read and attended. So it's a big jigsaw puzzle that one has to put together and make a sense out of it. And at the end of it, you have to make the audience happy, because it's a free lit fest, and they don't pay anything for it, which means if you don't pay for something, you don't have to go for it. So exactly. So when they don't pay for it and they still are tempted to come and attend it, then that is the success of the Lit Fest, I feel. So coming from 2013, where we barely had about 1,000 attendees, to 2019, where we had a footfall of about 18,000 people over 3 days. So I think that's a huge thing, and I'm very proud of my team and everyone associated with it for achieving it.
Superb. Now, Manjari, I understand that this literature festival, as you said, is a 3-day event. But definitely the preparations of it, we have spoken about it before, but let us speak about it on this podcast as well. That the preparation and the execution of it is not a 3-day event or not even a 3-month event. How does it span throughout the year?
Oh, yes. It starts at least 6 months before. Because imagine 125 sessions with so many speakers in it. So to plan that, you have to really start 6 months before, see who's available. And our festival has a social theme attached to it every year, which doesn't mean that the whole festival is on the social theme, but there is a social theme which has certain sessions, an exhibition on it. We have an exhibition on a certain author, a legendary author. So there are many components to the festival which all have to pan out in a certain way. So along with the theme of the festival, along with what we want to focus on that year, everything takes time. Takes planning, and it's a huge task. A lot of people, can kind of sit back and think, hey, I want to go to a lit fest. But seriously, it's not easy, even inviting your friends to a lit fest, because even there's a catch-22 situation. Do you have a book out? Do you fit in a panel? Do you fit in with the theme of the things? Do you get along with your co-panelists, because they have, there are ego issues that you have to handle. There are lots of things. So it's a huge bit of planning, right? 6 months before the festival.
And in the course of this literature festival, you must have made many friends. I mean, when I say friends, I don't mean the literature fraternity. I mean the other people who either come, or the kind of collaborators or the kind of stakeholders that you might be having. Would you like to tell me about those? Because as a attendee to a literature festival, as a participant, I do interact with the authors. I do interact with a few readers also, maybe the ones who come and talk to me. But I don't get to see the behind the scenes story. So why don't you tell us about that?
Well, yes, you need to have like-minded people on board. It's very important because I may have a certain vision for my festival, but my sponsors may not have. For example, I may want a certain person in my committee, but my sponsors may not want it. I may want a certain theme, my sponsors. So there has to be, it is a collaborative event. And I'm very lucky to have met the right people. For example, Vishwakarma Publications is our title sponsor. And they have always given me a free way in doing the festival in my own way, with my own ideas. They've never interfered. And I think that's a big boon, because they are publishing themselves. And every publisher would want to push in their books and support their authors, but they haven't ever made this compulsory to me. So I get to bring in whoever I want according to whatever is needed. So I'm very lucky to have Vishwakarma. MIT College has been with us right from the first year. So when we didn't have any space, they gave us the space in their college. They gave us things in kind. They gave in their volunteers. So they really helped us out from the first year onwards. In the third year, we moved from MIT to Yashoda, which was a more neutral place, because people began to think it was an MIT event, a college event. And we didn't want that, because it's not a college event, it's a national event. And so and that too, they understood, so the kind of collaborativeness that has been happening between us, all three, I'm really lucky, touch wood. And I feel that more and more same-willed people with the same vision are joining us every year. So it's a great thing to collaborate with, people with the same views and same ideas. Yes.
Superb. And what are the specific challenges that you would like to say about bringing up a literature festival?
Well, challenges. Your one hour podcast is not going to be enough for that. But let me begin with funds. Okay, funding is something that is very unique to a festival, because everything works on funds and sponsors. So I must have approached more than, let me say, 250 to 300 people over the last 7-8 years to try to get funds for PILF. Because it's a growing festival, and if you want to bring in bigger people, international, known figures, you have to put in money. Nothing comes for free. So that's why we need more and more funds. But I have to tell you this: the funding scene is so disappointing. People will tell me, "Are you going to sell a flat for us there? Will somebody buy my car?" And these kind of questions, and I tell them, this is a lit fest. I cannot sell your apartment here. I can't sell your car here. And not just that, people will, they'll say, will I be able to sit next to the chief guest? Will you, I can't tell you the kind of conditions that they lay out. Will you move your festival to our venue? It's like, I don't know how to handle them sometimes, but yes, I understand that everyone's looking in to their interest.
To maximize their interests.
Yeah, to maximize their interest. But they have to understand the limitations of a lit fest. They don't understand the importance as well. Like, people will go and give in to a blind hospital, which is a great thing, absolutely. But or give money to a mental hospital or whatever, which is absolutely wonderful and acceptable. But what they don't seem to understand is that you have to also put in money for preventive measures instead of curative measures. I seriously believe that a lit fest or literature, arts, everything helps to healing a person, to making a person whole, to giving them everything that they desire, to unburden themselves, to lose the emotional baggage. Literature has a big role in all of this. And this itself would prevent a lot of diseases from happening if they promote these kind of festivals and culture oriented festivals happen. Then a lot of goodwill, a lot of pressure will also be released from the festival. Goodwill created and pressure released from the festival, which would prevent more hospitals coming up. In a sense, more people in the hospitals. So this is a preventive measure, and they need to put in money in a preventive measure. So that is something they don't understand. I've tried to explain, but I'm still hopeful. So that's one huge challenge. The second huge challenge is that a lot of people sometimes, I call this my 170 weddings. Because it's people think it's my 170 daughters are going to get married. That's how they behave with me when they're invited to a festival. So the demands, the conditions of authors or speakers are so many. I tell them, boss, मेरे wedding नहीं है, मेरे घर की भी wedding नहीं है. आप आओ. It's a social cause. It's a platform for everyone. So I think that is another big thing for me. Inviting people and making them see that this is a social cause. It's a platform for everyone. And not everything is about money. I think these are the two basic challenges. Yeah.
Okay. So, if I may graduate like you have from Pune International Literature Festival to Pune International Spiritual Festival, how did Spiritual Festival come out? I mean, I understand that a festival is a gradual extension from one to the other. But are you a spiritual person yourself?
Yeah, very much. So, like I said, I've grown up in this atmosphere of astrology and meditation, and my mom is my first guru. So, I do believe that spirituality is not necessarily doing meditation and yoga, going to the Himalayas. I think there are spiritual things all around us, and there's a lot to learn from every single person we meet. And let me say this again: you can learn from every single person you meet, and it's everybody's journey that matters. It's how they do that journey that matters. International Festival of Spiritual India, and we call it in brackets for humanities and wisdom, is about providing tools for every human being to find the direction in life. So it's like we want every person to find their soul purpose, to learn something from the festival and take something back concrete so that you can live your life to the fullest. So when we did PILF in 2013, from then we had a couple of sessions on spirituality, and every year we have something to do with that. But it was last year that we decided that it was really time now to, this topic deserved a separate festival. And it was something very concrete that I wanted to give back to society. The underlying message in the festival is spread love, peace, compassion, make people conscious of their choices, and let them live a very compassionate life and spread love. So that is basically it. But you can't be compassionate and loving when there are things happening in your life all the time. There are upsetting things. You lose somebody. There's grief in your life. You lose a job. There's so many things happening. So how do you cope with all this? So that was the first step. We wanted people to have tools to cope with their ups and downs in life. And then the next step is, of course, to spread love, peace, compassion. So that is the goal of this festival.
Okay. And Manjari, my last question. You have been a very active advocate of animal care.
Yes.
How do you make yourself heard? I mean, I know that animals do play a role in your stories, but beyond that or within that, if you would like to tell us something about that, because that is something is very much the need of the hour as well.
Yes. So I do believe that coexistence and harmony is very, very important today. And it begins with caring for street animals. If all of us are looking for unconditional love. We are pining for love. Somewhere deep in our hearts, we are seeking love and some kind of a connection, some soul connections. And I feel if you want unconditional love, it begins with caring for street dogs. You see, they have nothing to gain from you. You have nothing to gain from them. When there's nothing selfish attached to each other, it becomes unconditional. And where will you get unconditional love from caring for animals? You won't get any votes from them. You won't get any money from them. No inheritance. You get nothing from them. So when it's that transparent, when that's clear, and when that's pure, that's where unconditional love starts, and that's where the reason for this existence begins. So I feel from my end, I have always cared for street dogs. Not just me, my entire family, my husband. For the last 30-40 years, we've taken care of hundreds of street dogs. We get them sterilized, we get them adopted. If they don't get adopted, we take care of them. We give them meals. We make sure that they are looked after. In our areas, of course, there's a huge population of unfed, hungry, ill and weak dogs out there, and a lot of people in their own capacity are doing things. And this is very important, because when so many compassionate people come together, there's bound to be a wave of compassion, snowballing into this world. And I call this my dog train of peace. It's something I really, really believe in, and my book will come out soon on that. Yes, it's going to be a very special book. It's completely nonfiction. It talks about experiences and my own personal theory of a non-spiritual path to peace in this world. So, so it's not just my passion. It's something I really believe in. And I think dogs are so connected to us. I do believe that DOG inverted is GOD. And it will take some time for people to understand this. Because I feel that there is a divine compartment in each person's heart. This divine compartment opens when you start taking care of animals. And that compartment has a direct connection to the divine. This is something I really believe in. And you can ask lots of animal lovers. You go out there and talk to, you sometimes you'll find animal activists very aggressive, very rude sometimes, because they've understood this and they want to explain it to others, but they can't do it because not everyone understands this. So I feel that the first most important thing to do is start caring for your street dog. It's the least they expect from you. A little bit of food, just a stroke on their head or a pat on their head is all they want from you. Love and a little bit of food. I think it's a good way to start compassion and love in the world.
That's so beautifully explained, Manjari. Thank you so much for coming with us on our podcast. And I really, really appreciate your time. I mean, the time that you have given to us for this recording. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you, Koral. I enjoyed talking about all this. I haven't really spoken in depth about all my ideas like this before. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk like this. And good luck for all your other sessions too.
Thank you so much, and big hug to you from Mumbai. But whatever, do feel the hug.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.